guys, I'm Raquel. Welcome to my channel Out of the Past, where I talk about classic movies. And today I'm reviewing two Kino Lorber Blu-rays, both starring Tallulah Bankhead when she was a contract player at Paramount Studios. And they are The Devil and the Deep from 1932 and The Cheat from 1931. Okay, let's start with the most interesting of the two, and that's The Devil and the Deep. This stars Tallulah Bankhead, Gary Cooper, Charles Laughton, and Cary Grant, which by itself is a fantastic cast and literally the #1 reason why you should watch this movie. So Tallulah Bankhead plays Diana. She is a wife to a Navy commander played by Charles Laughton. And he is a very controlling man. They're in a loveless marriage. He wants to control her, and she's just kind of wasting away. So under his command are two lieutenants, one played by Cary Grant, and he plays Lieutenant Jekyll, and Gary Cooper plays Lieutenant Sumter. So Cary Grant's character is the only one who's taken any sort of interest in Tallulah Bankhead's character. He feels pity for her, but he's also kind of in love with her, but she doesn't reciprocate the feelings. So Charles Laughton's character is like not conventionally attractive, and Cary Grant, obviously this is him at like the very beginning of his career, so he's just tall, chiseled looks, very stately, very handsome. So Charles Laughton definitely sees him as competition. So Tallulah Bankhead's character Diana, she basically is portrayed as a cheater. But she's not really a cheater because she's not in love with Cary Grant's character, but Charles Laughton thinks that she is. So there's this interesting dynamic. So one night she is completely distraught and she goes out. They're based in North Africa, and I think it's technically Morocco where they're stationed at the time. So she goes out into the street and they're having like some sort of some parade, and she gets kind of lost in the parade, and she stumbles upon Gary Cooper's character, Lieutenant Sumter, and they fall in love, and he has no clue that she's married to his boss. But eventually he finds out, and then there's all sorts of dynamics here. And the story culminates with this love triangle, and basically the finale happens in a submarine, which is very kind of exciting. So essentially it's interesting because at the surface this is very much like a heterosexual love triangle, but there's like some gay subtext here, which I think is really interesting, and you don't have to dig for it. It seems to be very apparent in the movie that Charles Laughton's character, Commander Charles Sturm, is seeing his wife as almost an extension of himself. In this world, in the society, he can't fulfill his desires. He can't acquire these men who are under his, like, he has power over them in a work capacity, but he doesn't have any power over them in a sexual capacity. And he also doesn't have that with his wife either. He is married, which is, you know, basically something that he's expected to do, but she is not returning his love or affection or attraction. So this is a man who has like this power because of his position in the Navy, and he's in control of all these people and in control of his wife, but he has no control over anybody in the end, which I think is a really interesting dynamic. I really love this cast. The beginning of the film introduces Charles Laughton as like this English import who is just amazing, and we're going to introduce him to you. It's not his first movie, but it's one of his early movies, and he was an established theater actor, you know, starting to make films. So this is like an interesting performance. This is very early on in Cary Grant's career. He was at Paramount at the time, making movies with like Mae West, and in the commentary on the Blu-ray, which is by, let's see, film historian David Del Val. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. He says that like at the time Cary Grant was like window dressing, and that is true. Like he was just incredibly handsome and really, really great to have on screen because you just want to stare at him. He's so gorgeous. Gary Cooper too, at the height of his beauty. They actually, Cary Grant and Gary Cooper, look quite a lot alike at this point in their lives because as they grew older, they had different acting styles, they had different personalities, they had different looks, but at this time they looked actually quite similar. Both very tall, chiseled features, very defined features, very, very handsome, very stately, and you just want to stare at them the whole movie. And Tallulah Bankhead's just a beauty, so it just makes sense that these two gorgeous men are attracted to this gorgeous woman. Now, what's interesting about Cary Grant is that when he was brought onto Paramount, he was essentially, or actually when he became an actor in Hollywood, he was essentially billed as a Gary Cooper replacement, like a Gary Cooper type. That's why his name was changed from Archibald Leach to Cary Grant. So if you take the G and C of Gary Cooper and you switch them to CG, you get Cary Grant, Gary Cary. So basically, Gary Cooper was really popular at the time and they needed somebody to kind of replace him with, like, you know, if he turned down a role, or they needed somebody who was kind of like Gary Cooper. So that's where Cary Grant comes in. So I think it's really interesting that you have both of these actors in the same movie. Now, Gary Cooper and Tallulah Bankhead are the romantic couple in this movie. They look really good together. There's not much chemistry. Tallulah Bankhead kind of seems bored with him, although Gary Cooper has this like kind of lustful energy that really comes through. So I could sense that he was really into her, but she's kind of like maybe still wary, and I don't know if that's like part of the character or is just the chemistry was just kind of on one side. And it's interesting that you have these two actors who are like incredibly gorgeous men, and then Charles Laughton is not conventionally attractive in terms of like, you know, this particular time frame. But it's interesting because there's one scene where he's just like, his character is griping about the fact that he's not handsome and these men are handsome, and Gary Cooper is so good looking, and Tallulah Bankhead's so good looking, and he's just not good looking, and he's just like holding his cheeks and he's like rubbing his face, and I feel like that's such a Charles Laughton thing to do. So I thought that scene was really, really interesting. There are some like unique shots. I think it was interesting how they had the Moroccan backdrop, and then they had the submarine as a setting towards the end. Otherwise, it's not a terribly like good movie, but it's enjoyable. It's an enjoyable movie, especially if you're interested in any of the actors that I had listed, because they're all, I think, really amazing, and it's great just to see them all together. Cary Grant has a small role kind of at the beginning, but it's really Gary Cooper, Tallulah Bankhead, and Charles Laughton who carry the rest of the film. So I would watch it for the cast and also the subtext. I think the subtext is super interesting. And this is the Blu-ray right here. So you have, there you go, you have Charles Laughton and Tallulah Bankhead, and then you have Tallulah Bankhead with Gary Cooper. And as I said before, this has audio commentary, and it also has some trailers of other Kino Lorber films, and it has English subtitles, which is always very helpful. Okay, on to The Cheat from 1931. This is also a Paramount movie, and this is starring Tallulah Bankhead. This one I think is interesting because of some of the context and then a particular thing that happens in the movie that is just quite striking. And just to remind you, these are both pre-code movies. So during the pre-code era from 1929, 1930 to 1934, you have these talking pictures which kind of push the boundaries of what was allowed to be shown on film, whether that's sex or crime or vice or all sorts of things. They're often shown in subtle ways and sometimes more provocative ways. And as you go through the years, like the later in the pre-code era, the spicier the movies get. So that's just something to keep in mind. Now with The Cheat, this is from 1931. And this is Tallulah Bankhead. She is the wife of, her name is Elsa, and she's the wife of Jeffrey. And Jeffrey's played by Harvey Stevens, not somebody I know too much about, but they are a married couple in the country club set. So they're kind of well-to-do, and I believe he's like an investment banker, or he's in some sort of investments. They're going through a bit of a financial hardship at the time, and her husband is really trying to get some money so they're more comfortable in life. But she happens to be a degenerate gambler. So she loses $10,000, which in 1931 is probably a lot of money. She loses $10,000 at a casino, like probably an illegal casino den at the time. And then she loses $10,000 more in a stock market scheme. So she's out $20,000, and here's her husband struggling to get money. So she's already kind of branded as like this woman who is kind of like the financial ruin of her husband. But her husband cares so much for her that he really tries to overcome her debt, and then that he knows of. There's also secret debt that he doesn't know of, and also try to make them comfortable. So they have this really loving relationship. In comes Irving Pitchell, who is like by far the most interesting character in this movie. He plays Hardy Livingstone, who also is part of this country club set. He is a very wealthy, very powerful womanizer. And what's interesting about him is that he's super interested in the Orient. There's a lot of Orientalism in this movie that makes it very problematic for sure because of how it depicts the Orientalism. But if you basically he has a lot of money, and she Tallulah Bankhead's character seeks him out to kind of help her with her debt, but he is lusting after her, and he really wants to attain her. And this is a man with a lot of wealth, a lot of power, and he's a womanizer, so he just expects that if he helps her with this money, that he's going to get her in bed. So he brings her, like he invites her over to his mansion, and the mansion is really interesting. It's decorated in all sorts of like ornaments. He's got this giant statue that is like the god of destruction, and when Tallulah Bankhead's character sees it, she's like horrified by it. He's got these weird dolls, and they're on these little pedestals with this engraving on them, which becomes important later on. He's got Japanese servants. He's like his house is literally decked out in all these like Oriental artifacts and decor. So he's like super into this. And one of the things that kind of shows that, and I'm not really sure if that meant that he himself was maybe like, raised in Asia, or he's not depicted as Asian himself, but maybe it's kind of suggested that he's either mixed race, or he comes from a certain background, or he's just really, really into this stuff. And there's even like this elaborate Oriental party where all the guests in the country club set are all decked out in this in these like Oriental themed costumes, and you have these dancers who are doing this kind of really strange dance, and it's all kind of like, okay, that's interesting, but what? So there's a lot of othering here. So it's depicted that his interest in the Orient and the exotic is an example of how he's dangerous. And that statue of the god of destruction is also symbolic of him being kind of a force of destruction in this world. And also in the life of Tallulah Bankhead. So it's super interesting. I'm not really like an expert on Orientalism in early Hollywood film, I do think it's interesting that Paramount actually had a few movies that depicted this sort of thing. Like I'm thinking like Klondike Annie, which came about 5 years after this one. That stars Mae West. She's a nightclub singer. Frisco Annie. She works at this kind of Oriental nightclub in San Francisco's Chinatown, and her boss slash lover is an Asian man, and he's kind of like possessive of her. She kills him and she runs away to Alaska to go into hiding, and she pretends to be a nun, which is kind of hilarious. But yeah, it's depicted that this kind of world is dangerous, and it's just, yeah, it's very, very problematic. But it's also interesting to look back and realize exactly how things were depicted, or how some people depicted Asian characters, especially Asians in America, and to learn from that so we don't repeat our mistakes. But so in the cheat, there is a lot of othering, very much so that this Irving Pitchell character is super into the Orient, and that makes him kind of dangerous. So the other aspect that's interesting of this is a little bit of a spoiler, but if you happen to look at any publicity photos for this movie, it's not a spoiler at all. So when he can't attain her, he takes, like, I remember I had mentioned the dolls that were on these little blocks that had these engravings. He breaks off one of the dolls, he takes the engraving, he heats it up, and he brands her. He brands her on her chest with his emblem. And I believe that's supposed to resemble sexual assault. And that's not something they could have shown. They could have hinted at it. They could have been more subtle, or could have happened off screen. But in this way, he like literally brands her with his like emblem to show, like, and he says, oh yeah, you can go show your husband now, like that you're a cheater. Because the cheat part of it is actually not gambling, but the promiscuity and adultery. So I think that's super interesting, because it gives, first of all, branding is incredibly cruel, and I think that's part of the othering too. And it's interesting because Tallulah Bankhead's character, like the branding is literally smoking. I don't know how they did that. That's like an interesting effect. It's like smoke is kind of coming from her like this, and she's like distraught, but she's not in pain. I have burned myself a few times. I've burned a large section of my leg. I've burned my wrist before. I was screaming in pain, crying, and about to faint. It is not something you can just like ignore the pain of. So that's not very realistic. However, the branding, I don't know, it's kind of like Scarlet Letter-ish. It's something she hides, but then like towards the end of the movie, she has this dramatic reveal where she like opens up, like she's wearing like these very low cut dresses, and she like opens up this like maybe a little more modest dress, opens it up and reveals the branding. If you look at the publicity stills for this movie, there's one shot of Irving Pitchell over Tallulah Bankhead, and he had just branded her. And it's interesting because it's on her shoulder. It's not on the chest. And then the big reveal is also a publicity still that they use. Like, it wasn't a still from the movie. It's really just like they posed all these actors to represent this one scene. And also the branding is on her shoulder and not on the front, on her chest. So it's interesting how they kind of, because the publicity materials are so public and they have to be kind of careful with that they hide the fact that the branding is on the chest and not on the back. Like, to make it a little less scandalous, they put it on her shoulder. So I just think that's super interesting. And branding is just horribly cruel. I've never seen this in a film from this era. Like you see branding in maybe other movies, but it's especially cruel, and that was really kind of took me aback. So yeah, so I think those are the two most interesting things about this movie, are the depiction of Orientalism and othering and the branding aspect. Otherwise, this is just kind of like a so-so pre-code film about this sort of strange love triangle and gambling and debt and the pressures of being in high society. Now, for anyone who loves 1930s aesthetics, if you love the fashion or the decor of the era, there are some gems in this. Now, setting aside any of the Oriental decor, I would point more to Tallulah Bankhead's wardrobe. She's got these really fantastic dresses. The one scene, she has a really like amazing, very sexy nightgown with like these ruffles. That's very interesting. There's one scene where she's talking to other women in the country club set, and they all have these amazing hats that I just wanted to rip off their heads and take for myself. They were wearing like cloche hats or like wide brim hats, and I was just like, oh, so in love. And there's one scene too where they're like Tallulah Bankhead's character's financial situation's a little better, so her maid brings her like breakfast in bed, and this like super ornate breakfast like tray, and it has a little spot for a newspaper, and it has like all these silver plated like things on it. There's one like very elaborate device or holder or something, and I still can't figure out what it is. So if you watch the movie, you figure out what it is, let me know. But I just think that's like, it's the epitome of elegance and just such a small little scene, which I think is super interesting. So this one is also like Devil in the Deep, in fact, that it has audio commentary on the Blu-ray. This is by film critic and author Simon Abrams, and I listened to some of the commentary for The Devil in the Deep, but I really wanted to listen to the commentary for The Cheat, because I really wanted to know more about how the representation of Asian culture and the Asian characters. There's a little bit about that, so if you want to listen to more about it, it is, like, as I said, it's a very problematic part of the movie, and I'm just even uncomfortable talking about it, but it's super interesting because that's like a really big part of the movie, and also it's good to know about this past so we kind of understand our approach to depicting like BIPOC characters of any type. So I think it's kind of a lesson for today, is looking at the past. So this also has trailers and also has subtitles, which I love. So I hadn't watched too many Tallulah Bankhead movies before, but it was really interesting to watch these two. She's quite dynamic. She was better known as a Broadway star and didn't do too great in films. Paramount didn't quite know what to do with her, but she's just really fascinating to watch on screen. So I definitely recommend checking both of these out from Kino Lorber. And thank you to Kino Lorber for sending me these for review. That's The Cheat from 1931 and Devil in the Deep from 1932. Thank you for watching. I hope you liked my video, and make sure to subscribe. I'll see you next time. Bye.